to really understand the present conflict in the Middle East, both geographically and politically, you must know some basic history. Although, as a history nerd, I'm going to make a detailed long video about the Ottomans in World War I, the individual battles, the way that they fought, their military technology, their alliances, all that. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Basically, the modern country of Iraq, the country of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Jordan, they're all modern. I thought it was crazy. These are ancient territories. Iraq, for instance, used to be Mesopotamia. It was ruled by the Assyrians. It was ruled by the Babylonians. But the modern state of Iraq is newer than the United States. The modern state of Jordan, which was called Transjordan, is newer than the United States. Basically, the Ottomans, they controlled present-day Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, and parts of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Iran. Under Ottoman rule, the empire embraced a diverse population, consisting of various ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. The Ottomans adopted a policy of millet, which allowed different religious communities to govern their own internal affairs under the empire's overall control. This system provided a degree of autonomy to religious communities, such as Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and allowed them to maintain their own legal and educational systems. The empire provided a degree of stability and security in the region. The Ottoman system of governance incorporated diverse ethnic and religious groups into a single imperial structure. Additionally, the Ottomans implemented centralized administration and maintained a powerful military, which helped to suppress local conflicts and maintain control over the region. The empire's network of trade routes and commercial centers also facilitated economic prosperity and cultural exchange. Basically, most of the Middle East was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. When they got involved in World War I, after they were defeated, all of those territories were then given to the British and the French. As the saying goes, to the victor goes the spoils. And in this case, they sure as hell got a lot of spoils. The Ottomans in World War I aligned themselves with the Central Powers, consisting of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. The empire's involvement in the war had a profound impact on its territory. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the empire was ruled by Sultan Mehmed and was already in a state of decline. But basically, let me boil this down to layman's terms. The Ottomans controlled Egypt, Syria, Libya, all of the modern-day Middle East for centuries. They had a strong military, so if somebody wanted to overthrow them, it was like lighting a match and igniting a flame, and then a giant hose would then squeeze out the flame before it got too large, or a giant fire extinguisher. There was stability simply because of a military. But once all of these regions got carved, sliced, and divided up, you had a lot of people who rebelled, and there's not much the British could do. But we'll get into that in a minute. There are a few individuals that are paramount in the creation of the modern Middle East. The first is Sharif Hussein. During World War I, he initially remained allied with the Ottomans, but began secret negotiations with the British on the advice of his son. There's a document, you can look this up, just put it into Google. It's called the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. A series of letters that were exchanged in World War I, in which the government of the UK agreed to recognize Arab independence in a large region after the war in exchange for Sharif of Mecca launching the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. The correspondence had a significant influence on Middle Eastern history during and after World War I. A dispute over Palestine continued thereafter. The correspondence is composed of 10 letters that were exchanged from July 1915 to March 1916 between Hussein and Lieutenant Colonel Sir Henry McMahon, a British High Commissioner to Egypt. The primary reason for the letters were to maintain the support of 70 million Muslims in British India. Great Britain controlled India at the time. The area of Arab independence was defined to be in the limits and boundaries proposed by Sharif. The boundaries and territories caused subsequent controversy later on during the years. McMahon's promises were seen by the Arabs as a formal agreement between themselves and the UK. On this understanding, the Arabs, under the command of Hussein's son Faisal, and we'll get into him in just a minute, he's another important figure, established a military force that fought with Lawrence of Arabia against the Ottoman Empire during the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt, encouraged by British promises, Sharif Hussein initiated the Arab Revolt in June 1916, with the aim of liberating Arab territories from Ottoman rule. He declared himself the king of the Arab lands and called upon Arabs to rise up against the Ottomans. The revolt included territories such as Transjordan, Palestine, and Iraq. The Arab forces, led by figures such as Lawrence of Arabia, employed guerrilla warfare tactics against the Ottoman forces. They conducted hit-and-run attacks, sabotaged Ottoman infrastructure, and targeted the lines of communication. The Arab forces also received support from the British, who provided them with weapons, supplies, and military advisors. The revolt achieved some significant successes. The Arab forces captured several important cities, disrupted Ottoman supply lines, and tied down a considerable number of Ottoman troops. They also contributed to the overall weakening of the Ottoman Empire in the later stages of World War I. However, despite their efforts, the Arab nationalist aspirations were not fully realized. Secret agreements between the British and French, such as the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, we'll get into both of those in a minute, divided the Arab lands into British and French spheres of influence. After the end of World War I, the Arab territories were placed under British and French mandates, and the dreams of a unified Arab state were shattered. After the war, in 1924, following a series of conflicts and power struggles, Hussein was forced to leave and he went into exile. His son later became the first king of Jordan. Basically, the British wanted the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Hussein saw himself, Sharif Hussein wanted to be king of the Arabs. The British, through their correspondence, told him that if you lead a revolt of the Arabs, then we will give you land after the war. But of course, the British never meant to do that. They already had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or PICUT, but I call it Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration, which we'll get into. They were essentially double-dealing behind everybody's back. And after the war, nobody was happy. Even the French had double-dealings behind their back. Basically, the British double-dealed, triple-dealed, and kind of took what they wanted from everybody and left everybody else the scraps. That's kind of really what led to the situation. But another important figure who was also involved in the Arab revolts is Faisal of Iraq. He was a significant figure in the history of modern Iraq. Faisal, with his father Hussein, played a crucial role in the Arab revolt. After the war, the League of Nations issued the Mandate for Mesopotamia, officially placing Iraq under British administration. In 1921, Faisal was installed as the first king of Iraq. Basically, he was a puppet of the British. Mesopotamia was originally just a territory, but the modern state of Iraq was created by the British mandates, and we'll get into all that later. The most prominent figure who really created this situation is named Lloyd George. Perhaps no individual is more responsible for the modern Middle East than George. He served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1916 to 1922. He was responsible for the Sykes-Picot Agreement, also known as the Asia Minor Agreement, was a secret agreement reached during World War I between France and Great Britain, with the assent of Russia. It was signed on March 16, 1916. The agreement aimed to define the spheres of influence and control that the British and French would have in the Middle East, particularly in the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The agreement's negotiators were Sir Mark Sykes for Britain and Francisco George Picot for France. Under the terms, the region was divided into areas of direct and indirect control. And we'll go over those territories later on. The agreement disregarded existing Arab nationalist movements and their aspirations for independence. It contradicted the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. It was kept secret during the war, but leaked and became publicly known in 1917. Lloyd George was also responsible for issuing the Balfour Declaration, a statement made by the British government in 1917 during World War I. It expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, then under Ottoman rule. The declaration was named after Arthur Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time. The declaration, it was issued in a letter from him to a prominent official, Lord Rothschild, who was a prominent British Zionist leader. It stated His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the right and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. After World War I, Britain was granted a mandate by the League of Nations to administer Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration was included in the text of the United Nations mandate. This led to increased Jewish immigration in Palestine, which in turn created tensions with the Arab population. Lloyd George also partitioned the countries in the Middle East after World War I. It is worth noting that Lloyd George's influence in the Middle East declined after he left office in 1922. However, his actions during his time as Prime Minister had a lasting impact on the region's political landscape and continue to shape its dynamics to this day. No individual is more responsible for the modern geography of the present Middle East than Lloyd George. Here's the territories that were created after the war. Partitioned, rather. They were not created, they were partitioned. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled. The British Mandate for Palestine, French Mandate for Syria and Lebanon, British region that would later become Iraq, British Mandate for Transjordan. The British established their control over an area that would later become the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Newly created states, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Republic of Turkey, which emerged from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Iraq, Republic of Lebanon, State of Syria, State of Israel. All those territories were essentially created as new states. Think about this. Basically what happened was, after the Ottoman control was dismantled of all those territories, the British knocked down a domino, and essentially you had a domino effect which caused a lot of shit, I guess you could say. I was trying to think of a more intellectual way to say it, but a lot of shit that happened. Dominoes that fell after the war. Egypt demanded independence in 1918, followed by rioting in 1919. 1919, war broke out in Afghanistan. Transjordan reached disturbances in 1920. Arab riots in 1920, and Iraq flamed into a revolt. One of the problems that the British had, now that I read you the history, I'll give a little bit of commentary, and then I will conclude. One of the problems the British had, and the West has had for a long time, is they don't understand that the Middle East has different sectors of religion. You have the Shiites, you have the Sunnis, and different territorial ambitions. You have the Kurds, who want their own state. You have the Ba'ath Party, which Saddam Hussein was part of. You have all kinds of different, you have Arab nationalists, but they just thought the Arabs are one people. If we can just get them to all be connected as one, then, that's all we got to tell them. But they didn't really take it into this account. To be fair, their information wasn't as good as ours. I'm reading this book that talks some about this, and in the book it says that the only information they had about the Middle East, like the history of it, in English was only one book. And that book was written by somebody who was biased for the West, and they looked at them through the prism of the West. Kind of like when you read about the people who sacked Rome, the Romans viewed them as barbarians, and they kind of set the narrative, and that's kind of how it was. They didn't have a good education, a good understanding of it. And you see that today. A lot of people, they just don't understand. They think all Muslims are the same, or all sectors of Islam are the same. You can have your own opinion, but you just need to know the right information, is all I'm saying. What's also interesting is in the post-war negotiations, Woodrow Wilson That was the first time the U.S. president at the time, that was the first time he actually left the country and wanted to sign the armistice in person. They actually wanted the U.S. to be part of their colonial ambitions, but Woodrow Wilson opposed them. Now, the problem with Woodrow Wilson was a combination. First is that he wanted to create the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. He had he had his 14 points, and he wanted fairness, fairness, fairness. Well, Woodrow Wilson had a stroke, and he was focused on getting the League of Nations passed, which never passed the United States Congress. And while that was happening, Lloyd George was pretty much left to do what he wanted. What's really strange is that the U.S. never really had any political ambitions in the Middle East for a long time. I'll talk about this in another video, but Eisenhower, actually, when he became president, didn't want the British or the French during the Suez Canal crisis to attack Egypt because he thought of colonialism. I don't want any more colonialism. If we can show the Arabs that we're not colonists, then they will think we're fair. We're not like the British and the French. We're not part of the Zionists either. So he condemned them and wanted peace to happen. He demanded that Israel withdraw their troops from the Suez Canal and actually sided with Egypt. We'll get into that in another story, in another video. But he didn't want to be seen as an imperialist, and that's kind of what he thought initially. But the U.S. wanted to not be seen as an imperialist like the rest of the West. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, he became prime minister, was one of the last people who believed in the British Empire. Even though they were spending all this money in different countries trying to stay in control of their empire, Winston Churchill basically was holding on to a lost idea. He wanted to continue colonialism, which was unpopular at the time, even in the 1950s. But eventually he went to Jamaica, he had a stroke, and he eventually kind of stepped down. And the guy that replaced him didn't believe as much in colonialism. But now that these maps are drawn, now that instead of Mesopotamia you have Iraq, you have Saudi Arabia and all these modern states, you have different governments. Saudi Arabia and Iran right now are getting involved in proxy wars in Syria, Yemen, and other places. Just because someone is a Muslim and an Arab doesn't necessarily mean that they agree on everything. And historically speaking, most people that have gotten in fights are people that are similar. Most people that have killed Western people are people in the West. The British killed the French killed the British, the Russians killed the French killed the Russians. It's the same way in the Middle East. Just because someone is in one region doesn't mean they agree. And that's what the British didn't understand. But to surmise, the modern Middle East was controlled by the Ottoman Empire before World War I. Due to them losing the war, the British gained control over those territories. They controlled some of those territories. They redrew the maps, placed in their own governments, and that's what we're left with today.